Section 8 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Revival of Classical Learning, 1390 to 1509, Part 1. When the great masterpieces of ancient literature were first rediscovered, and then spread far and wide by means of manuscript and printed copies, the effect on intellectual minds was not a little like that described at the end of the last chapter. A wide and grand America of inward thought was restored after centuries of oblivion, and that with the effect not merely of increasing knowledge, but of revolutionizing all methods of reasoning, placing all opinions in a different point of view, and awakening a new and energetic trust in the future. There could be no doubt whatever that life was worth living when any day might restore to students some new treasure of lost wisdom, and when, moreover, each new discovery threw ever-increasing light upon those already made, and brought nearer and nearer the final victory over the old learning, which not seldom employed its crabbed and debased Latin in investigating by hopeless logical methods a variety of questions which had better have been left alone. Knowledge now showed herself once more enrobed in beauty. Accordingly, the time was one of progress, such as it is hard for us even to imagine. Of course, the knowledge of Latin writers had never thoroughly died out in medieval Europe. Monks had cultivated their domains according to the precepts of the Roman writers on agriculture. At a very early date, Virgil and Horace, with Statius and Ovid, were read in German schools, and at home we have only to look through a few pages of Chaucer to see his familiarity with these poets. Infinite pains were every now and then employed in ransacking libraries for manuscripts of the great Latin authors. In this way, the celebrated Poggio Bracciolini, while attending the Council of Constance in 1415, discovered at the monastery of St Gall, covered with filth and rubbish and on the point of perishing from age and neglect, what turned out to be a complete copy of Quintilian and another of the greater part of Valerius Flaccus's Argonautica. The same distinguished bookfinder afterwards lighted upon the last 12 comedies of Plautus and Cicero's Verrine orations, De Oratore and Brutus. Others of Cicero's orations had been discovered about a century before. After adding a manuscript of Lucretius to his discoveries, Poggio sought with the utmost anxiety, but in vain, for the works of Tacitus. These were not discovered till nearly 100 years later, when a copy of the Histories came to light in Germany and was presented to Pope Leo X. Most passionate of all was the longing to discover the lost works of Livy. A monk assured Poggio that he had seen a copy in the Cistercian monastery of Sora, but all inquiries for it were in vain, and the blank still remains unsupplied, except as regards about 30 books. The enthusiasm for classical works was in proportion to their rarity. Alfonso of Aragon, King of Naples, refused, even when engaged in a campaign, to miss his daily lecture on Livy, and is said to have been cured of a severe illness by the delight of hearing Quintus Curtius read. Even at an earlier date, Giovanni di Ravenna, a pupil of Petrarca, knew by heart all the classics which had been discovered up to his time. Nor had Petrarca himself been far behind on this point, for he tells us that in the course of a walk he went over in his own mind the whole works of Virgil, Orosius, Pliny, Mela, and Claudian, in order to remember all that these authors had said about the position of Ultima Thule. Indeed, this great man, who is reverenced as the father of Italian patriotism, may also be said to have done more than any other single person in restoring scholarship, and that more than a century before the times of the great Renaissance. From him the enthusiasm for these pursuits spread very widely in Italy, and even strongly affected politics, inasmuch as Rienzi's rebellion against the papal power in 1347 was an attempt to set up once more in Rome the authority of the Senatus Populusque Romanus, and was entirely founded on classical ideas, thus gaining Petrarca's strongest sympathy. Yet even the enthusiasm of this period was slight in comparison with that of the later time, when Greek teachers and Greek books came at last to exhibit ancient thought, not in the form which Roman eclecticism had given it, but in its simple and native beauty. The more advanced knowledge of Greek began with Manuel Chrysolorus. This eminent man came to Venice about 1390 to entreat help against the Turks, who were already threatening Constantinople. When his embassy was over, he was persuaded to return and settle at Florence as professor of his native language. In 1422, Francesco Filelfo, Chrysolorus' son-in-law, and two other Italians, Guarino and Aurispa, were dispatched to Constantinople to collect books. Guarino was shipwrecked on his return, and one of two valuable cases of manuscripts went down with the vessel, a disaster which is said to have turned his hair completely white, though he was hardly 20 years old. Aurispa, more fortunate, arrived at Venice in the next year, bringing 238 precious volumes, among which were the works of Plato, Lucian, Xenophon, Diodorus, Arrian, Strabo, Callimachus, and Pindar. Filelfo himself remained abroad till 1427, and then returned to become the master of Greek learning in his native country. After him, a succession of magnificent scholars maintained in this new field the honour of Italy. When Henry VII came to the throne, the celebrated Politian, so named from his birthplace, the Tuscan Montepulciano, his family name being Ambrogini, was 30 years old and had greatly distinguished himself by his knowledge of the classical authors and of Roman laws. Contemporary with him was Marsilio Ficino, the translator of Plato, and Pico di Mirandola, who before his death at the age of 31 had studied Jewish literature with the most unwearied industry, was planning a gigantic defence of Christianity to be founded upon it, and lived in hope of being allowed to preach this doctrine, going from town to town barefooted with crucifix in hand. At this point began the connection of English scholars with Italian learning, inasmuch as William Grocyn, after having been for some time Greek professor at Oxford, spent 2 years, somewhere between 1485 and 1491, at Florence, attending the lectures of Politian and Chalcondylas, and about the same time the celebrated Linacre, afterwards founder of the College of Physicians, was selected because of the elegance and modesty of his manners as the associate in study of Lorenzo de Medici's children. On their return, these heroes of learning communicated their own ardour to kindred spirits in England, above all to Colette, afterwards Dean of St Pauls, who himself spent some time in Italy, and to Sir Thomas More. What rank was held by these last in the Republic of Letters we can in some degree judge from the account of them given by Erasmus, who, on coming to Oxford in 1498 to study Greek there, declares that to be in company with such men as Colette he would not refuse to live even in Scythia. "When I hear my friend Colette," he says on another occasion, "it is like listening to Plato himself." In Grocyn, who does not admire the wide range of his knowledge? What could be more searching, deep, and refined than the judgment of Linacre? And when did nature ever mould a character more gentle, endearing, and happy than Thomas More? We may judge, too, of the boldness with which literary research was then pursued by the recorded fact that Grocyn, after giving at St Paul's the 1 or 2 first lectures of a course on the celestial hierarchies, which were supposed till then to have been written by Dionysius the Areopagite, the disciple of St Paul, suddenly announced to the astonished audience that continued study had made him absolutely disbelieved the genuineness of this work, and that the course was therefore at an end. No such bold assertion had been made since Lorenzo Valla had dared to prove the letter of Abgarus to our Lord and the donation of Constantine to be forgeries, and in uttering it Grocyn may be said to have inaugurated that English love of truth in matters of knowledge and science which has borne ever since then such noble fruits among us. Thus classical literature soon became in England a pursuit most generous and inspiring, never getting pedantic as in Italy, where men quarrelled almost to the death on the smallest matters of philology, and on such questions as whether Lucius and Aruntius were sons or grandsons of Tarquinius Priscus. Still less was there ever in England any of the strange longing for heathenism which appeared every now and then in Italy, as when Pomponius Laetus raised an altar to Romulus and imitated in private the worship described by Ovid. Nor were Englishmen ever inclined to heathenize Christianity by classicizing the language of the Bible, as when an Italian expressed God the Father by Nimborum Pater Imbripotens, the Holy Ghost by Caelestis Zephyrus, and the Eucharist by Syncerum Cererum. Far different were the thoughts which occupied such men as More, Colet, Grocyn, and Erasmus. We find More, for instance, lecturing at St. Lawrence Church in the Old Jewry on the Civitate Dei of Augustine, that is, on the ways of God to man. A very singular occupation, remarks Sir James Mackintosh, for a young lawyer. His house was, according to Erasmus, a school and exercise of the Christian religion. All its inhabitants, male and female, applied their leisure to liberal studies and profitable reading, though piety was their principal care. From purely classical work, More was debarred in later life both by his civil employments and by the practical turn of his mind. What his taste in such matters was, we may guess from his sending to his imaginary Utopia a pretty fardel of books, containing the most part of Plato's works, some of Aristotle's, and Theophrastus on plants. Of the poets, he continues, they have Aristophanes, Homer, Euripides, and Sophocles, in Aldus small print. Of the historians, Thucydides, Herodotus, and Herodian. They set great store by Plutarch's books, and are delighted with Lucian's merry conceits and jests. Learning like this had been thoroughly transfused into More's mind, and had in manner become his very self. Instead of merely quoting Plato, he tried to think as Plato would have thought if placed among the exigencies of modern life. In the same manner, Colet, Dean of St. Pauls, looked upon all classical acquirements as valuable mainly from its power of ordering the mind for thought purposes and raising it to the noblest objects. A theologian above all things, he loved chiefly to dwell on St. Paul's epistles, the Gospel history, the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. But all these subjects were animated by him with the new spirit which springs from a liberal education. He delighted, as Mr. Seebohm says, to trace in St. Paul's epistles the marks of the apostle's character, the vehemence of speaking, which would not allow him to perfect his sentences, the rare prudence with which he would temper his speech to meet the needs of the different classes by whom his epistle would be read, his eager expectation soon to visit Spain, which, however, did not make him impatient when it was disappointed. Like Dr. Arnold in our own time, Colet would illustrate St. Paul by reference to the state of Roman society as described by Suetonius. In all these and many other ways, the choicest results of scholarship were as thoroughly employed by him for religious purposes as they were by More to bring about reforms in state administration. Unlike his two cherished friends, Erasmus was the scholar pure and simple, the man who had no occupation apart from his books. Moreover, he was a thorough cosmopolite. Born in 1467 at Rotterdam, He had as little of the typical Dutchman in him as can be imagined. Indeed, nothing was ever so intolerable to him, except indeed the monastic life at Stein, from which he had escaped in order to study at Paris, as the interminable feasts of his native country, and the utter disesteem in which learning was held there. From the terrible wretchedness to which his poverty condemned him at Paris, he was rescued by Lord Mountjoy, who brought him for the first time to England in 1498, settling on him a small life pension. With this and the presents which he soon began to receive, Erasmus contented himself, refusing the offer of a semi-royal pupil, James Stanley, the king's step-brother, who was to be equipped with sufficient learning to allow of his being made Bishop of Ely when just out of his teens. Before the time of Erasmus's second visit to England in 1505, he had become confessedly the first classical scholar in Europe, and was well received by Archbishop Warham and by Bishop Fisher, who were both patrons of the new learning. Utterly rejecting any use whatever of modern languages, he had formed for himself a Latin style of surpassing excellence, which seemed able, without departing from the old forms and structure, to express all the 10,000 objects and circumstances of modern life. He had in 1500 taken the world by storm with his Adagia, a work in which, after the fashion of Italian politicians, he grouped round a number of proverbs all the associated thoughts which he could remember in ancient writings. As specimens of these may be mentioned two on which he was for ever harping, Nihil monaco indoctius and Dulce bellum inexpertis. His bitter hatred for the old life at Stein was brought out in the first, his deep grief at the devastation of Italy in the second. It is striking to find that amid the manifold hardships of his third journey to England, which immediately followed the accession of Henry VIII, the terrible weather through which he rode, and the filth and rudeness of the roadside inns, he could quietly occupy himself in planning his wonderfully witty encomium moriae, the praise of folly, in which he most impartially satirizes bookworms, grammarians, rhetoricians, lawyers, schoolmen, pilgrims, pardoners, schoolmasters, sportsmen, monks, courtiers, princes, kings, and even the Pope himself. His colloquia are still more admirable from the brightness of their style and their beautiful description of religion working amidst all the various circumstances and accidents of common life. In reading them, we are perpetually reminded of Socrates' gentle and kindly persuasiveness as described by Xenophon. For, like the Athenian philosopher, he is occupied in showing how youth can be delightful and gracious, how old age and death may be disarmed of all their terrors, and how a simple heart, void of superstition, is able to bear up against even the extremest hardship and danger. Above all, there stands out in this, as in all his writings, a heartfelt admiration for the simple life of a kindly household. Like Luther, he is never weary of contrasting this with the so-called religious life of monasteries. Even apart from the corruptions found in the cloister, he is firmly persuaded that those who adopt such a life choose not the better but the worse part. Strongly indeed were these admirable works calculated to influence England, where indeed more than one of them were written. In point of fact, their author seemed at one time likely to stamp the age with the mark of his own moderation, thoughtfulness, and humanity. In the course of the subsequent history we shall see what he thought of the wars which were soon to disappoint his best hopes, and what farther contributions he was, in spite of them, to make to the welfare of both Church and State in England. The question now occurred to thinking minds by what educational institutions there would be the best chance of giving the rising generation a firm hold on the new learning, and new and noble foundations for this purpose soon came into existence. Richard Fox, who had distinguished himself while Bishop of Durham in repelling Scottish invasions, afterwards, when Bishop of Winchester, founded the grammar schools of Grantham and Taunton. At Oxford he had thought of erecting a monastery, but was dissuaded by Oldham, Bishop of Exeter, who with remarkable foresight inquired, "Would it not be better for us to provide for the increase of learning, and for such as shall do good to the Church and Commonwealth, rather than build houses and provide livelihood for monks, whose end and fall we may live to see?" Accordingly, Bishop Fox founded Corpus Christi College, the statutes of which strongly enjoined the fellows to pursue the new learning. The professor of Latin then was particularly ordered to extirpate barbarism, that is, monkish Latin, ut barbarium a nostro alveario extirpet, and the Greek professor was to read and explain all the best writers in that language. Benefits of the same kind had been conferred on Cambridge by the munificence of the Lady Margaret. Herself a person of simple and uncritical piety, and as disinclined as possible to go in search of new things, she was nevertheless so thoroughly under the influence of Bishop Fisher, her chaplain and confessor, that she was induced to erect Christ's and St. John's colleges in that university in the interest of the newer studies. Both of these were old institutions, much decayed. She gave them suitable buildings and provided for the masters, fellows, and scholars incomes, not splendid according to our notions, but such as would supply the low living which was then thought to lead to high thinking. Of Christ's College, which alone was completed in her lifetime, she made Fisher the visitor, thus securing that its members should live up to their founder's idea. The fellows were to have an annual stipend of 13 shillings 4d to 16 shillings 8d according to their degrees, with 1 shilling a week for commons and 13 shillings 4d a year for their livery, which was to be of cloth of one colour, bought at the celebrated National Emporium of Starbridge Fair. In all elections the poorer candidate was to be preferred. Anyone who had a private income of £10 was ineligible for a fellowship. Dogs and hawks were forbidden in college. Cards and dice were to be played only in hall at Christmas time, when other jurisdictions were for the time superseded by that of the Rex Natalitius or King of Noel. What precisely was meant by secular, that is, non-monastic education in those days, we are quite clearly informed in the detailed accounts which remain of the foundation of St. Paul's School in 1510 by Dean Colet. This was to contain 153 boys, the number being taken from that of the fish in St. John 21, and to be taught the old Latin speech, the very Roman tongue used in the time of Tully and Sallust and Virgil and Terence, the Latin adulterate which blind fools brought into the world being absolutely banished. They were also to learn Greek, if such can be gotten, a cautiously worded injunction, and probably meant to avoid exciting suspicion against the school as teaching the language of heresy. Colet commissioned the learned Linacre to draw up a Latin grammar to be used at St. Paul's, but when it was done thought it too long and involved for his little beginners. The first headmaster was William Lilly, the godson of Grocyn and friend of Moore. He had learned Latin in Italy, and had lived for years at Rhodes to perfect himself in Greek. In the opinion of Erasmus, who thought a teacher as important to the Commonwealth as a bishop, Lilly was a thorough master in the art of educating youth, which meant, as another letter of Erasmus shows, that among other qualifications he had studied Plato and Aristotle among philosophers, among poets Homer and Ovid, in geography Mela, Ptolemy, Pliny, Strabo. The teacher, Erasmus continues, should be able to trace the origin of words and their gradual corruption in the languages of Constantinople, Italy, Spain, and France. He should know the ancient names of trees, animals, instruments, clothes, and gems, with regard to which it is incredible how ignorant even educated men are. I want the teacher to have traversed the whole field of knowledge, that he may spare each of his pupils doing it. The good dean of St. Paul's, though unwilling to give up the stimulus of learning which corporal punishment affords, was yet vehement against the tyrants who thought that only by flogging could boys' unruly spirits be tamed. Doubtless there was room for change in this point, when it was thought a proper evidence of discipline to scourge an undergraduate of Christ's College, Cambridge, under the Lady Margaret's window, she not interfering except by calling "Lente, lente," and when little boys used to be whipped in the presence of guests during dinner, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they might. Finally, instead of appointing ecclesiastics as visitors of St. Paul's School, Colet placed it under the most honest and faithful fellowship of the mercers of London, under married citizens of established reputation, as Erasmus puts it. Among all men to whom life had introduced him, the dean had found, he said, least corruption in these. End of Section 8.